All right, let's go to Mark, and we're going to finish up Mark and get into the Gospel of Luke tonight in our survey of the New Testament. Thank you, Charlie, for that presentation. I like the background information as well as the comparative of the different gospel narratives. Each one is very different, isn't it? That's what you found. Each one has a different information, and then you get a complete picture by putting all of them together. So this is class number 9, and we just have, as far as classes together after tonight, just 3 more classes. So if you've started, don't quit now. It is definitely too late to quit, okay? You might as well just finish out this semester. Even if you say, oh, I don't think I want to do this anymore. Well, just finish this semester and then maybe you'll continue next semester. But we'll take that one when it comes. But just let's finish strong. And we're coming up into April this Sunday already. Isn't this great? We're out of the winter time. I'm excited about that. I put the fertilizer down on my grass and had beautiful rain on Saturday. So my grass is like so nice and green. I woke up Sunday morning. That made me a little bit happy. And so we're going to finish Mark. And we said this was our theme verse about being a minister. And the irony of that is that Mark failed in his ministry. Isn't that incredible? That's a real blessing that Mark failed as a minister on that mission, on that first missionary journey. And yet he wrote the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of Man, the minister of all men, the servant of man. So we looked last week at some of the unique aspects of Mark's gospel, because so much of what Mark does right is also included in Matthew. We said 90% of Mark is in Matthew, 50% of Mark is in Luke, being the shortest gospel, but it's still unique and still necessary. So I just want to look at just a couple more verses here in Mark, some of the unique verses in Mark. And one of them, and I asked Esther to find Mark chapter 14 and verse 62. And then Bailey, you'll be next with Mark 16:9. But Esther, could you please read Mark chapter 14, verse 62? And this is the trial of Jesus Christ, and he's here before the Sanhedrin, and they're trying to grasp at something that he did wrong so that they could have him crucified. And then the high priest asks him who he is. And why don't you even back up to verse 61 and 62, Esther, if you could read those 2 verses, please.
61. But he held his peace and answered nothing. Again, the high priest asked him and said unto him, Art thou the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven.
Okay, and the high priest knew, or at least in his mind, believing that Jesus was just a man, that he was declaring himself to be God. He tears his clothes and he says, this is blasphemy. Now, sometimes people actually say, I've heard people tell me, Jesus Christ never said himself that he was God. Well, here he does. He clearly says in these verses, I am. And that's a very direct statement, more direct than even the other gospel accounts. And then, of course, quoting from Daniel, the Son of Man on the right hand of power in the clouds of heaven, that he's the Messiah and the Messiah is God manifest in the flesh. So that's a verse that is really amazing in the Gospel of Mark. And then the last verse I just want us to look at as very unique. And this is absolutely unique in all of the resurrection accounts. And it's in Mark chapter 16 and verse number 9. And so Bailey, could you look at that verse and read that verse for us? Mark chapter 16, verse 9.
Was risen early the first day day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, one of the women who had cast 7 devils.
Okay, so Mark tells us there who the first one Jesus appeared to after he rose again from the dead. And it is who? Mary Magdalene. Only Mark tells us this. And this actually throws a wrench into or the chronology of the resurrection accounts fit together. If Jesus appeared first to Mary, then it kind of makes the puzzle even more interesting to piece together Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in a chronological account of the resurrection. But all you have to do is listen to the Heritage of Faith Conversations program on Resurrection Day, and we are going to go through the chronological account of the resurrection. So we won't get into that now. But he appeared first to Mary, which is very, very interesting. Now, of course, that is actually to the first verse in this chapter, going to the end of the chapter, that is disputed by some of these modern and inferior translations that put doubt upon whole passages of scripture, like they do in Mark chapter 6. And that's the first verse. So according to the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus and these so-called more ancient manuscripts, that verse shouldn't be in the Bible. But beloved, it's the word of God. It should be in the Bible. And the vast majority of manuscripts have these verses in the Bible. So just to say that if you're reading from an NIV or New American Standard or any multiple number of these more modern translations, they say this is not sometimes they'll even say in the best manuscripts, but that's an opinion. That's a pure opinion. And I disagree with that opinion, and many others do as well. So just wanted to throw that in there also regarding Mark's gospel. And I will just answer this question because people would have questions about this. In verse 17 and 18, as Mark's gospel ends, where the Lord says, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." And so obviously these are signs and wonders that were active in the first century church during the days of the apostles. So I do believe that the Lord is speaking here of the signs and wonders ministry that would follow them who believe while the word of God was being written, and also while the apostles were living and while they were serving, because there could be a lot of abuse with this. I mean, there's like people who do snake handling, for example. Jesus didn't say, bring snakes into your church and put snakes onto the pulpit and then pick up snakes. That's not the point there. But the point is, if you are being persecuted and perhaps they did, somebody brought a snake out to try to bite you and with venom to kill you, that God could overrule that too. And Paul was bitten by a snake, and there's actually an example of Paul being bitten by a snake. And so we see these things, though, fulfilled in the apostles' ministry. Paul being bitten by a snake, of course, laying hands on sick, even the dead. And if a person has a gift of healing, the ultimate demonstration of that gift is to do what? To raise the dead. And both Peter and Paul raised the dead in the book of Acts. And of course, signs, which was done during the New Testament era of the apostles and so forth. So I don't believe that these are necessarily ongoing throughout the whole life and history of the church. And obviously not everybody's going to agree with that, but that's my understanding on that. Okay. Now, does anybody have any questions about that or anything else? And then I just want to give you this. Here's the outline of Mark. You could jot that into your notes. And I'm getting this outline from the Jensen book, so it is not original. I'm using the Jensen outline that he has on page 153. That's the same outline there. And I just have the 3 blanks there for the outline: the service of Jesus Christ, sacrifice of Jesus, and then the triumph of Jesus, his resurrection. Okay, any questions or comments at all? Okay, so you don't have any questions about the Gospel of Mark. All right, here we go. So let's look at Luke. So by the way, if you have any questions about these things as we're going through, and if you just want to throw out a question, I'll try to answer it. If I don't know the answer, I'll try to find out the answer. Okay, so always feel free to ask questions. So we're in the Gospel of Luke. I personally think that the Gospel of Luke is as unique as the Gospel of John. I mean, they often say Matthew, Mark, Luke are synoptic Gospels, and that John is uniquely different from the other 3. And it is. I'm not disputing that. But I think you could say Luke is as uniquely different from the other 3 as well. That's just my take on it. Now, I see where there would be more in common with Matthew and Mark that Luke has than with John. I see that. I think we can all see that. But I'm just saying Luke has so many unique things and emphasis about it. So we're going to talk about it. Now, most people would think that Paul wrote most of the New Testament. I said that on the radio one time. I said, the one who wrote more words in the New Testament was Luke. Somebody said, "You're so stupid. How could you say that? Paul wrote 13 books. Nobody else wrote." I said, I didn't say who wrote the most books. I said, who wrote the most words? And Luke and Acts comprise 27% of the New Testament, which is quite amazing. Paul, 25.6, John, 17.7. So let's talk about Luke for a moment, the author. We know him to be the caring physician, and he's called the physician. Micah, if you could read that verse, and then Angela, you'll be up next. If you could get that verse. Micah, if you could read Colossians 4 and verse 14.
Colossians 4:14, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you.
Okay, so there he is. He's the beloved physician. So he's the caring physician. And Luke, and you might say it's small, so we're not going to look up the different verses, but Luke does use more specific medical terminology to describe illnesses. For example, the man with the withered hand, Luke said it was his right hand. For the leper, he said he was full of leprosy, not just have leprosy. And also for Peter's mother-in-law, who was sick, he said her fever was great. So those differences might seem minor to us, but he's a doctor. So for a doctor, it's a big difference whether they just have a fever or a great fever, or whether it's their right or their left hand. So, or whether they just have a common case of leprosy, or whether they're full of it. So he does give more specific language and showing that he's a doctor. Now, the next thing here is, and this is what Jensen says as well, and many people would say this, it's on page 156 in your book. He was born of Greek parents, a heritage that made him probably the only Gentile writer of the New Testament. So if you're at work and you want to start a conversation with someone, that's an interesting question. You could ask an unsaved person. Say, you know, we're Gentiles, we're not Jewish people. Do you know there was one person in the Bible who wasn't Jewish, who wrote a book of the Bible? Do you know who that is? That's good. I probably wouldn't know the answer to that question if I weren't thinking about it right now. So it's a good question, and maybe spark a conversation. So Gentile. Some have suggested that Luke studied at the University of Tarsus, not unlike the schools of the Apostle Paul, that the Apostle Paul would have attended. So that is maybe a reason why Luke and Paul did get together. And Luke joined Paul, of course, on his missionary journeys. And then the fourth thing here is letter B. Luke was a careful historian. So we're going to have Angela read these verses, very interesting verses in the Gospels. So Angela, could you read Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4?
For as much as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seems good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed.
Okay, so when we pick up these books of the Bible, Luke doesn't introduce himself. I am Luke, I'm writing this. Through various ways, Luke's authorship has been determined, as well as the book of Acts. So how would we know, for example, from right here, though, that Luke wrote not just Luke, but Acts? He's writing to Theophilus, which also is what he's doing in the book of Acts. So you see that internal evidence. So we see the similarity of authorship there by that statement. Luke, being a doctor, very interesting. The word eyewitnesses is autoptes. We get our word autopsy from that word witness. So it's a unique word for witness. So it's a medical term. So Luke is basically doing, if you will, he says people who saw the life of Christ have already done an autopsy on his life. In other words, they've written it out. And Luke says, now I want to join with them, even as they delivered unto us, from which from the beginning were eyewitnesses. And then he says ministers of the word. That is also a unique word, which is a word for intern, like somebody who would assist in a medical surgery. So again, it's a medical term. So those are two interesting terms Luke uses right off the bat to show his medical background. Now, Luke was a constant companion of Paul. That's letter C. As Mark came under the influence of Peter, Luke came under the influence of Paul. Now, I didn't assign these verses to anyone, but why don't we go to Acts chapter 16. And Maureen, are you there? Is Maureen here tonight? Maureen, could you get for us Acts chapter 16? And if you could get and verse number 10.
Okay.
If you could read verse 9 and 10 of Acts chapter 16.
Acts 16:9. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. There stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, saying, come over into Macedonia and help us. And verse 16.
Verse 10. Verse 10. I'm sorry. The next verse.
Verse 10. And after he has seen the vision, immediately we endeavored to go into Macedonia, assuredly gathering that the Lord had called us for to preach the gospel unto them.
Okay, now why would I have you read those verses? Because of the pronouns in these verses. A vision appeared to Paul, and it says, come over into Macedonia and help us. And then it says, immediately after Paul, had seen the vision, immediately, what's the pronoun after that? We. So at that moment, Luke joins Paul. Before that personal pronoun, a personal plural pronoun of we is not used. So, for example, even up to verse 7, look at verse 7. It says, they were coming to Mysia. They say to go to Bithynia. Verse 8, they. So it's very, there's an emphasis there. It's they, and now it's we. And after that, it's we. So Paul is joined by Luke at this point. Somebody's going to laugh at what I just said. We. Okay, sorry. So that's very interesting. Again, in verse 12, it says we and on. So so he becomes a constant companion to Paul after this. And that's why Paul later calls him a beloved physician. And again, I know I've said this, but bears repeating. Mark writes Peter's gospel, and Luke, in a sense, from the human perspective, writes Paul's gospel. And that makes sense to me. So you have Matthew, and then you have, in a way, Peter's emphasis, and you have Paul's emphasis and or influence, and then you have, of course, the beloved disciple John, all inspired by God, obviously. Okay, so okay, just if you could jot these blanks down. Early church leaders recognize Luke as the author. Justin Martyr, Eusebius, Clement, and I think those names may become more familiar to us because of church history, and that's good. Irenaeus wrote Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book, the gospel preached by him. So this is what we would call external evidence of the church fathers giving evidence to Luke's authorship. People who were close to the fact do verify, corroborate Luke as the author of the gospel. And internal evidence points to Luke because of the similarity of style in Acts and Luke. Also, the medical language in both the Gospel of Luke and Acts demonstrates the writer's interest in disease. Okay. By the way, I have pictures of an artist that I like. His name is James Tissot. So I just have pictures there. Some of them might relate to this, but this story is in the Gospel of Luke. This would be the story of Jesus in the temple at the age of 12, only told by Luke in the Gospel. And the last blank here on this page, Luke's polished literary style would appeal to the intellectual power of the Greek mind. Okay, just a few more blanks. Yes. Well, I think he's writing to a Theophilus, which would be I'm sure a popular name, a lover of wisdom, of God, a lover of God, right? And so I don't see why it wouldn't be a real person myself.
I heard that two different versions.
Yeah. I don't think it would be damaging to say that he was just talking, in a sense, writing to all of us who are Theophiluses. I mean, if you want to look at it that way. But if you want to become a Theophilus as you read the Gospel of Luke or Acts, that's not a bad thing to say. I'm going to be Theophilus. It's kind of like 1 John. These things have I written unto you that believe on the name of the Son of God. We can embrace that. I believe on the name of the Son of God. So he's written this to me. So I'm a lover of God. I'm a Theophilus. He's written it to me. So, I mean, that's okay. But it would seem to me that there was a real person that he was writing to. Did you want to? Yes, Charlie?
Going back over, I was kind of curious. The only indication that we have that he was, I guess, fully Greek, but maybe possibly a proselyte is that just, I guess, historical accounts.
Yeah. Just from what I've read, honestly, his genealogy is not given, but yeah. Okay, so I just want to get up a little bit here and then we'll be done. So you could jot these things down. Luke presents Jesus as the Son of Man. Luke 19:10 is the key verse. Raul, do you have that verse for us? Raul? And I'm going to ask Charlie, Kerry, and Ruth, you're going to read those last three verses for us before we do close tonight. So Charlie, Raul, I'm sorry, do you have that verse for us, please?
Yes, Luke 19:10. For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which was lost.
Okay, so that's the key verse. I do want you to know the key verse of Luke 19:10, just like I want you to know Mark 10:45, key verse of Mark. So that's a key verse. The Son of Man is come to seek and to save. Luke presents Jesus as the Son of Man in his genealogy. He goes all the way back to Adam, showing Jesus's connection to the human race. That he is the last Adam. He is the second man, but he is Lord from heaven. So Luke's gospel is the longest, the most chronological, the most comprehensive of the synoptic accounts. Okay, just jot these in. He gives a full account of the birth of John the Baptist. He's the only one who does. He gives a full account of the birth of Jesus Christ, the announcements to the angels and the shepherds. He's the only one that does. And number 3, you could write letter D. That's where we're going to stop. But write letter D. There's our friend Theophilus. He writes to confirm Theophilus in the faith. But I want to look at 3, and these 3 verses, which are very critical verses. And here is where, when I was saying how different Luke is from the other 4 gospels, and makes his gospel, to me, just as unique as, let's say, John's gospel is. And it's his emphasis on the Perean ministry of Jesus Christ, which is during the last 6 months of his earthly ministry. And it was outside, it was north and a little bit east from Jerusalem. And Luke has these 3 verses, and they're very interesting how they're placed in the gospel record. And they show Jesus from Luke chapter 9, verse 51. And many people would say this is where this Perean ministry starts, and then where there's a whole lot of just absolutely unique information that's in Luke's gospel, not in the other gospels. I mean, just think of how rich we are because we have Luke's gospel. We have the stories of the Good Samaritan. We have the stories of the prodigal son and the parables, multiple parables, multiple narratives, the narrative of the rich man and Lazarus. And I could go on and on. So many unique stories only in Luke's gospel in this Perean ministry from Luke chapter 9, verse 51 through about Luke chapter 19. And there's 3 verses, and they all show Jesus directionally moving toward Jerusalem. So we're going to finish reading those. And Charlie, if you could read first Luke chapter 9, verse 51, please.
And it came to pass, when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem.
Okay, and so here he is on his way, it says, to Jerusalem. Now, he's not going to go there in a direct shot because a lot of other things are happening. But the next verse, Kerry, I want you to read it as loud as Charlie just did. No, I'm just kidding. No, I just well, he was really, because no, that was good for the people on Zoom. Not, you don't have, I'm just teasing you, Kerry. Okay, Luke chapter 13, verse 22.
Luke chapter 13, verse 22 reads, and he went through the cities and villages, teaching and journeying toward Jerusalem.
Okay, so again, he's journeying and he's going toward Jerusalem. What is he going to do in Jerusalem? He's going to die. So it's as if through this whole Perean ministry, he is focused on his death in Jerusalem, preparing to die. And then the 3rd verse that speaks of his direction toward Jerusalem is Ruth, if you could read that. It's Luke chapter 17 and verse 11. And these 3 verses are referenced on point number 3 in your notes. Okay, Ruth, could you read that?
Luke 17:11. And it came to pass as he went to Jerusalem that he passed through the midst of Samaria and Galilee.
Okay, so what's interesting now, when he passed through Samaria and Galilee, it still sounds Galilee. Where's that in reference to Jerusalem? That's north. It's way north. So way back in chapter 9, he was going toward, he was steadfast, his face was steadfastly set toward Jerusalem. And here he's still passing through Galilee to go where? To Jerusalem. So it's very interesting. God puts these things in the Bible to grab us and say, wow, how does this work out? So go work it out. All right. Have a good evening, and we'll stop there and continue next week. And Ruth is going to have her presentation next week of Jesus calming the water, right? Look forward to it. Okay, we'll take a bit of a break. And does anyone want to take the quiz here?